Otto.
Hello.
Hi. Could you shortly introduce yourself? What do you do as a designer?
I work with fashion mainly, and I try to look at fashion from sort of a different angle or something. I try to look at what happens if we approach fashion as a system differently, in the sense of, you know, could fashion be an operating system, and what would be a hacker mentality to that? What would it mean if we would sort of try to create open source or try to create other models, perhaps inspired by the models of our time, and see how fashion could work differently that way. And I try to sort of look at then what sort of different practices would that mean, what different role for the designer, if you're not the sort of the star designer that sits in the top and has sort of your own name on the brand, you know, what sort of other practices would you need to learn, and how would you work in the world as that type of fashion designer?
So you're a professor at integrated design, right?
Yes.
So how would you describe integrated design, and what is the program about, and what is the range that students of work students do in your program?
I think the difference from many other design programs is that it has a lot of elective space. You can sort of make your own mix of different classes from all over the new school, and to sort of create your own little soup, in a sense, you know, and mix it together. And I think from my perspective, what's interesting is that it's about integrating these type of practices in new ways. You know, if you pick electives about social justice or food justice or any type of global issues, whatever, how does that influence your design practice? So it doesn't have sort of, a sort of a classical silo model of design, there's industrial design or it's sort of urban or whatever. It's very open in that way, but it's very much about how do you integrate these into new practices. And to me, I think it's also interesting thinking then about, how do you as a designer integrate your practice into an already existing system? How, instead of creating your own dropout culture, what does it mean as a designer to sort of insert your practice in an already established system and try to sort of bend that? So that's what challenge, or what I think is really interesting about integrated design.
I just want to say the quote that once you said, it's about plugging in into the other different fields. So I really like this expression, like that you can plug yourself in. You're not in one major only designer skilled.
No, exactly. And I think especially sort of within some of the sort of, fashion design, for example, where you try to grow your own big ego in a sense to become a brand, that is very much about sort of dropping out in different ways, about sort of, finding your little niche. I think it's much more interesting to think about, where do you plug in and how does that, influence the practice you do and that system that you want to sort of influence. What does it mean if you sort of a plug-in designer that plugs into an NGO or plugs into, a municipality, plugs into, a fashion brand or whatever. So what sort of skills would you have as that type of designer?
One thing that I found during our common work, I think, was dealing with social justice in design, because I know that it means a lot to you, that it's one of your major aspects. And also dealing with like small, fashion hacking. It's like developing your own skill, how to be sustainable, independent from all this industry. I feel your design very much in this way. Do you agree?
Yes, and I think, of course, it stems from a sort of DIY, do-it-yourself practice. But to me, I think it's interesting to combine do-it-yourself, in the sense of the skills that you have, which you learned from school or from your grandmother or whatever about sewing. But what does that mean with sort of do-it-together practice? How do you network all these fragmented DIY practices into a sort of a larger culture or an ecology or whatever you want to call it? In the sense that they would actually sort of support each other, so that you would feel that, oh, you're not alone by the kitchen table doing your little thing, but how do you produce a scene around that? I think Brian Eno's discussion about scenius is interesting. He means that very often we look at genius, we look at individuals that has this great ideas in mind, and we fail to see the scenes where this happens, sort of the scenius which is happening between people, the genius that is collective. And I think that, so how do you as a designer work to empower and produce seniors then, rather than sort of educate a single user to sort of, how do you network practices together? And to me, for example, this clothes swaps that I did in Istanbul, the Swaporama, were just an interesting example because, it brought together a lot of people to first swap clothes, but also sort of change them. But at the end, there would also be a catwalk show and sort of, a sort of a nightclub event, because it would also be about, these people coming together and feel that they share practices together. It's not about being alone only, it's very much about being together.
And also in terms of, let's say, social justice, or because you talk many times about that fashion is very exclusive, it excludes many groups of people, and how do you then deal with them? Because let's say it's if people are obese or disabled, handicapped, they don't find their space in classical, or let's say in the ready-to-made fashion, right?
Right, and especially these days, because I think there is a general sense that consumerism is democratized. As it gets cheaper and cheaper, we feel, or people think in general, that oh, this is great, consumerism is getting democratized. But of course, there's people excluded. It's not. It's a market that is aimed towards the middle class to buy more. We should buy more flat screen TVs and whatever. Or more clothes. It's not about that. It's actually fashion produced for people with disabilities or obese people or something like that. A lot of people are still excluded. It's mainly a democratization for the people who were already included. So to me, it's very much about, so how do we highlight this? How do we make this seen for fashion designers to see that they're actually perpetuating this type of unjust system, and how can they possibly find ways to address these exclusion mechanisms and work more with inclusion, if that's interesting for them. And there's the paradox there, which I think is the interesting part. That fashion, to be fashionable, means that it's fairly exclusive. So what does it mean when it's inclusive? What is the balance between those? Can it still be fashionable? And how would you still, produce?
So you those then out of this, I would assume that you're interested in dealing with the aspect of fashion that is mostly left aside, and it's not so much, in the front page.
Oh yes. I think that's the sort of the alternative fashion systems, or whatever you would say. The things that we don't see on Project Runway. That is really what is fascinating to me. And I think also other ways of thinking about production. Also other places. How can we facilitate production here? And not only overseas. And what does it mean if we start? If we partly produce at home, or what is a community garden for fashion? What is a CSA? Sort of where you subscribe to a farmer. Could you subscribe to fashion and have a sort of a more personal relationship to the fashion designer in some way? Could there be other economic models by which we survive as a fashion designer? How can we be inspired by other models than the ones that we sort of brought up with? What does it mean? Can a fashion store work like a hairdresser, in a sense that you come there and you actually leave with less hair than when you came? It's a sort of very sustainable practice, but still you go there every month to get your hair done. So what would that type of engagement be? And you sit there and you gossip with the neighbors, and and you read the magazines, and you get a massage or a hair, whatever. Could you get the same type of service from a fashion designer? Or could there be just like some sort of fashion therapy? Could there be I go to the doctor every month and have my fashion confessions or something? Or what other role of the fashion designer would it be than just make clothes, put on the hanger, and sell? So of course there's a zillion different models out there. It's just that we only look at what others have done before us, and not to we don't look to the sides. I think that, for example, we can look at other values. So how can a garment mobilize other values? And I think, for example, the concert T-shirt is a perfect example of that. It's fairly cheap. At the same time, it can be a very emotionally sort of saturated garment that I've worn this T-shirt. I was at the Iron Maiden concert in 1984. I'm so washed out this T-shirt, but I had it. It's real from that concert. So that there's one sort of a very sort of a cheap value, but it's sort of an authenticity value. On the other hand, I've been doing a project with students in London where we have made community repair. Everybody started with a garment that needed mending, and then they went back in their community and tried to find someone to repair it with them. in order to create a site-specific repair, and they weren't allowed to pay for it. So the whole idea was that there was some sort of barter and some other values that you would sort of, negotiate with the people from your neighborhood, get to know your neighbor, and at the same time manifest this relationship into a garment that then became small stories and exhibit and garments that somehow spoke back to the community. And I think there's zillion ways we need to start experimenting with this, and very rarely we hear that from within the fashion system. So, how do we, sort of within the academia, create this sort of think tank and do tank where we kind of experiment about these kind of alternative practices in order to sort of enrich the ecology of fashion?
Right now, it's